The campfire flickered as if the air itself trembled. A deafening roar echoed through the night, followed by the sound of trees snapping like twigs. Whatever made that sound wasn't just big, it was hunting. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Sarah Bennett zipped up her light jacket as she stepped out of her car, the crisp morning air nipping at her cheeks. The great Smoky Mountains loomed before her, shrouded in a light mist that promised to burn off as the day progressed. She took a deep breath, savoring the scent of pine and damp earth. "Another beautiful day for a run," she murmured to herself, a smile playing on her lips. Sarah had been an avid trail runner for years, and the trails in the Smokies were her favorite. As a school teacher in Asheville, North Carolina, she cherished these early morning runs before heading to work. They cleared her mind and invigorated her for the day ahead. She did a few stretches, her muscles welcoming the familiar routine. The parking lot was empty save for her car, just how she liked it. Solitude in nature was her form of meditation. "All right, Sarah," she said, psyching herself up. "Let's see if we can beat yesterday's time." With a final adjustment to her ponytail, Sarah set off down the trail. Her feet found their rhythm quickly, the soft thud of her trail runners against the packed earth a comforting sound. The crisp mountain air filled her lungs, energizing her with each breath. The trail started off wide and well-maintained, winding its way through towering pines and flowering rhododendrons. Sarah's mind wandered as she ran, going over her lesson plans for the day and thinking about the upcoming weekend. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the fork in the path. Pausing for a moment, Sarah consulted the small trail map she always carried. Left it is, she decided, choosing the path that would take her deeper into the forest. As she continued her run, the trail gradually narrowed. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out over the path and creating a green canopy above. Shafts of early morning sunlight broke through in places, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Sarah's breathing became more labored as the trail began to ascend. She welcomed the challenge, pushing herself to maintain her pace. Sweat beaded on her forehead and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. "Come on, Sarah," she panted. "You've got this." The mist that had hung in the air earlier now clung to the undergrowth, giving the forest an otherworldly feel. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she knew it was likely just her imagination running wild in the quiet of the woods. As the trail curved around a large boulder, Sarah found herself squeezing between thick bushes that seemed to grab at her clothes. She chuckled nervously, pushing aside a branch that threatened to snag her jacket. "Geez, when did this trail get so overgrown?" she muttered, making a mental note to mention it to the park rangers on her way out. Suddenly, a rustle in the undergrowth to her left made Sarah pause. Her heart rate, already elevated from the run, kicked into overdrive. She strained her ears, trying to identify the source of the noise. "Hello," she called out tentatively. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her, broken only by the soft chirping of birds and the whisper of leaves in the gentle breeze. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. "Get it together," she chided herself. "It's probably just a squirrel or something." Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive and alien. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more pronounced. Sarah shook her head, trying to dispel the creeping sense of dread. "You're being ridiculous," she said aloud, her voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "There's nothing to be afraid of." She forced herself to start running again, her pace quicker than before. The faster she ran, the sooner she'd be back in familiar territory, she reasoned. As she rounded the next bend in the trail, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Sarah's eyes widened in shock and terror as she found herself face to face with a massive black bear and her cubs. The bear, startled by Sarah's sudden appearance, rose to its full height, towering over her. Its eyes, dark and intelligent, locked onto Sarah's. For a moment, neither moved. frozen in a tableau of mutual surprise. Then, with a deep, rumbling growl that Sarah felt in her very bones, the bear dropped to all fours. Its muscles bunched, preparing to charge. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd ever learned about bear encounters. Should she play dead? Try to appear big? Run? The decision was made for her as the bear let out a deafening roar and charged. Sarah's fight or flight response kicked in, and she turned to run, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. But the bear was faster. Sarah felt a powerful blow to her back, and suddenly she was airborne. The world spun around her as she tumbled down the slope, branches whipping at her face and body. She came to a stop at the bottom of the incline, the wind knocked out of her. Gasping for air, Sarah tried to scramble to her feet, but a searing pain in her ankle sent her crashing back to the ground. The bear was upon her in seconds. Sarah could smell its musty odor, feel its hot breath on her skin. She threw her arms up in a futile attempt to protect herself, squeezing her eyes shut and bracing for the worst. The bear's teeth sank into her calf, and Sarah screamed in agony. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, white-hot and all-consuming. She thrashed wildly, trying to free herself from the bear's grasp, but it was like fighting against a force of nature. "Help!" she cried out, her voice echoing through the forest. "Somebody, please help me." But there was no one around to hear her cries. As the bear's teeth dug deeper into her flesh, Sarah's mind filled with regret. Regret for running alone, for not telling anyone where she was going, for thinking she was invincible in this wild place. The forest, once her sanctuary, had become a green hell. The trees that had sheltered her now seemed to mock her plight, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The soft forest floor, which had cushioned her footfalls, now seemed to be trying to swallow her whole. As blackness began to creep in at the edges of her vision, Sarah had one last coherent thought. This can't be how it ends. Then, miraculously, a voice rang out in the distance. "Hey, get away from her!" The pressure on Sarah's leg suddenly released as the bear's head snapped up, distracted by the new threat. Through the haze of pain and fear, Sarah saw a figure waving its arms and shouting. The bear hesitated for a moment, torn between its prey and this new potential threat. Then, with a final growl that Sarah felt reverberate through her entire body, the bear turned and lumbered back into the undergrowth, its cubs scrambling after it. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full extent of Sarah's injuries made themselves known. Every part of her body screamed in pain, and she could feel warm blood seeping from the wound on her leg. The stranger who had scared off the bear was rushing towards her, his face a mask of concern. "Oh my God, are you okay? Can you hear me?" Sarah tried to respond, but all that came out was a weak groan. The world around her began to spin, the trees blurring into a green smear. As she slipped into unconsciousness, Sarah's last thought was of the bear's eyes, wild and unknowable, staring into her own. Little did she know, those eyes would haunt her dreams for months to come. A constant reminder of the day the trail she loved so much nearly became her final resting place. Sarah's world exploded into chaos as the bear's roar reverberated through her body. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching into eternity as the massive black bear charged towards her. The forest around them became a blur of green and brown, the only clear image the bear's eyes locked onto hers with terrifying intensity. "No, no, no!" Sarah's scream tore from her throat as she stumbled backward, her feet tangling in the underbrush. The bear closed the distance with frightening speed, its powerful form barreling towards her like a freight train. In that moment, all of Sarah's knowledge about bear encounters fled her mind. She had always prided herself on being prepared, on knowing what to do in an emergency. But faced with the reality of a charging bear, instinct overrode reason. She turned to run, her legs pumping furiously, but the uneven terrain betrayed her. Sarah's foot caught on a protruding root and she felt herself falling. The ground disappeared beneath her as the bear's powerful blow sent her tumbling down the slope. "Help!" Sarah cried out as she rolled, her body bouncing off rocks and smashing through underbrush. Branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging cuts. She could hear the bear crashing through the forest behind her, its heavy breathing mixing with her own panicked gasps. Finally, Sarah's descent came to a jarring halt at the bottom of the slope. Pain radiated through her body, but there was no time to assess her injuries. The bear was almost upon her. Scrambling to her hands and knees, Sarah tried to crawl away, but a searing pain in her ankle sent her crashing back to the ground. "Please," she whimpered, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "Please, someone help me." The bear's shadow fell over her, and Sarah rolled onto her back, facing her attacker. The animal's eyes were wild with fear and aggression, its teeth bared in a fearsome snarl. Sarah threw her arms up in a futile attempt to protect herself. Searing pain exploded in her calf as the bear's teeth sank into her flesh. Sarah's scream echoed through the forest, a primal sound of agony and terror. "No! Stop! Please!" The bear's jaws clamped down harder, and Sarah felt as if her leg was being torn apart. She beat at the bear's head with her fists, kicked with her free leg, but it was like hitting a brick wall. The bear was immovable, consumed by its instinct to neutralize the perceived threat to its cubs. "Let go," Sarah sobbed, her strength waning. The pain was all-consuming, radiating from her calf throughout her entire body. She could feel warm blood soaking her torn running pants, could smell the coppery scent mixing with the bear's musky odor. In her pain-addled state, Sarah's mind raced. Would anyone find her body? Would her students wonder why she didn't show up for class? Would her parents have to identify her remains? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a voice rang out through the forest. "Hey, get away from her!" The bear's head snapped up, its jaws releasing Sarah's leg. Through tear-blurred vision, she saw a figure on the trail above them, waving its arms and shouting. "Over here, leave her alone!" the voice called again. It was a man, Sarah realized dimly. A hiker, perhaps, drawn by her screams. The bear let out a low growl, clearly torn between finishing its attack and responding to this new threat. Sarah lay still, afraid that any movement might redirect the bear's attention back to her. "Come on, get out of here!" the man yelled, his voice cracking slightly with fear. He picked up a stone and threw it, the projectile landing a few feet from the bear. That seemed to make up the bear's mind. With a final rumbling growl that Sarah felt in her bones, the animal turned and lumbered back into the undergrowth. She could hear the cubs scrambling after their mother, their small bodies rustling through the bushes. As the immediate danger passed, the full extent of Sarah's injuries made themselves known. Every breath sent waves of pain through her body. Her calf throbbed where the bear had bitten her, and she could feel blood still flowing from the wound. "Oh my God, are you okay?" The hiker was scrambling down the slope towards her, his face a mask of concern. "Can you hear me?" Sarah tried to respond, but all that came out was a weak groan. The world around her began to spin, the trees blurring into a green smear. "Stay with me," the man urged, kneeling beside her. "I'm going to call for help." "What's your name?" "Sarah," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Okay, Sarah, I'm Jim," the man said, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to get you out of here, all right? Just hang on." As Jim dialed 911, Sarah fought to stay conscious. The pain in her leg was excruciating, but she was afraid to look at the damage. Instead, she focused on Jim's voice as he spoke to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, I need help. There's been a bear attack." "No, the bear's gone now. We're on the Blue Ridge Trail, about 2 miles in from the eastern trailhead. The victim is conscious but badly injured." "Okay, I'll stay on the line." Jim turned back to Sarah, his face pale but determined. "Help is on the way, Sarah. They're sending a rescue team. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Sarah swallowed hard, her mouth dry with fear and shock. My leg. The bear? It bit my leg. And I think my ankle might be broken. Everything hurts." "You're doing great, Sarah," Jim reassured her. He shrugged off his backpack and pulled out a first aid kit. "I'm going to try to stop the bleeding, okay? This might hurt, but I need to put pressure on the wound." Sarah nodded weakly, bracing herself. As Jim pressed a gauze pad against her calf, she couldn't suppress a cry of pain. I'm sorry," Jim said, his voice thick with empathy. "I know it hurts, but we need to slow the bleeding." As Jim worked, Sarah's mind wandered. The events of the past few minutes seemed surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The peaceful morning run that had turned into a fight for survival. the bear's eyes wild and unknowable that she knew would haunt her dreams. "Jim," she whispered, needing a distraction from the pain and fear. Why are you out here so early?" Jim gave her a small smile, clearly understanding her need for normalcy. "I'm a wildlife photographer. I was hoping to get some shots of the sunrise over the valley. Never expected to run into something like this." A weak laugh escaped Sarah's lips, quickly turning into a groan of pain. "Guess you got more than you bargained for." "You could say that," Jim agreed. He glanced up the slope, listening. "I think I hear the rescue team. Hang in there, Sarah. You're going to be okay." As if on cue, voices called out from above. "Hello? Rescue team. Can you hear us?" "Down here," Jim shouted back. "We're down the slope." The next few minutes were a blur for Sarah. Park rangers and paramedics appeared, their voices a jumble of medical jargon and reassurances. She felt herself being carefully lifted onto a stretcher, an IV inserted into her arm. As they began the difficult task of carrying her up the slope, Sarah's eyes locked onto the forest where the bear had disappeared. Somewhere in those woods, the animal that had nearly killed her was going about its day, unaware of the profound impact it had on her life. The last thing Sarah saw before they loaded her into the ambulance was the treetops, swaying gently in the breeze. The same trees she had admired at the start of her run. But now, instead of beauty, all she saw was danger lurking in the shadows. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens wailed to life, Sarah finally let the darkness overtake her, the bear's roar still echoing in her ears. Through blurred vision, Sarah saw Jim frantically waving his arms and shouting at the retreating bear. The world seemed to spin around her, the forest a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. She blinked hard, trying to focus, but the pain radiating from her leg made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. "Sarah? Sarah? Can you hear me?" Jim's voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking to her from the end of a long tunnel. She managed a weak nod, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her body. Jim knelt beside her, his face etched with concern. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his eyes darting nervously towards the woods where the bear had disappeared. "Do you think you can stand?" Sarah attempted to push herself up, but a searing pain shot through her ankle, causing her to cry out. I don't think so," she gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "My ankle, I think it might be broken." Jim nodded grimly. "Okay, don't try to move. I've called for help, but it might take them a while to reach us. We're pretty far out on the trail." Sarah's mind raced with panic. How long would they have to wait? What if the bear came back? She could feel warm blood seeping through her torn running pants, a stark reminder of the severity of her injuries. "The bear," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's gone for now," Jim reassured her, though she could hear the tension in his voice. "But we should try to move to a more open area just in case. I'm going to have to carry you, Sarah. It's going to hurt, but we need to do this. Are you ready?" Sarah nodded, bracing herself. As Jim carefully slid his arms under her, she bit her lip to stifle a scream. Every movement sent waves of agony through her body. I'm so sorry," Jim muttered as he lifted her. Sarah could feel his arms trembling with the effort, and she marveled at his strength and kindness. Here was a stranger, risking his own safety to help her. They moved slowly through the forest, Jim carefully picking his way over roots and around bushes. Each step jostled Sarah, and she couldn't hold back her whimpers of pain. "Talk to me, Sarah," Jim said, his breathing labored. "Tell me about yourself. What do you do?" Sarah recognized his attempt to distract her from the pain, and she latched onto it gratefully. I'm a teacher," she managed between gasps. "5th grade, in Asheville." "That's great," Jim encouraged. "What's your favorite subject to teach?" "Science," Sarah replied, closing her eyes against a wave of dizziness. "I love seeing the kids get excited about experiments." They continued like this, Jim asking questions and Sarah answering as best she could, as they made their way slowly back down the trail. Sarah's responses became more disjointed as time went on, the blood loss and shock taking their toll. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, they heard a shout in the distance. "Hello, rescue team. Can you hear us?" Here, Jim called back, his voice hoarse with relief. We're over here. Soon the forest was alive with activity. Park rangers and paramedics swarmed around them, their voices a cacophony of medical jargon and urgent instructions. Ma'am, can you hear me? A paramedic leaned over Sarah, shining a light in her eyes. Can you tell me your name? Sarah, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Sarah Bennett. Okay, Sarah, we're going to take care of you now, the paramedic assured her. You're going to feel a little prick. We need to start an IV. Sarah barely felt the needle going in. Her world had narrowed to a haze of pain and confusion. She was vaguely aware of being lifted onto a stretcher, of straps being secured around her. BP's dropping, she heard someone say. We need to move fast. As they began to carry her out, Sarah's eyes sought out Jim. He was standing to the side, talking to a park ranger, his clothes stained with her blood. Jim, she called weakly. He turned, moving quickly to her side. You're going to be okay, Sarah, he said, grasping her hand briefly. These guys are going to take good care of you. Sarah wanted to thank him, to tell him how grateful she was, but the words wouldn't come. As they lifted the stretcher, the motion sent a fresh wave of agony through her body, and she couldn't hold back a cry of pain. The journey out of the forest was a blur of jostling movement and intermittent pain. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, the canopy of trees above her merging into a green haze. Finally, they reached the trailhead. The sudden brightness as they emerged from the forest made Sarah squint. She could hear the wail of sirens growing louder. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the forest. The trees that had seemed so welcoming just hours ago now loomed ominously. Somewhere in those woods, the bear that had attacked her was going about its day, unaware of how it had changed her life forever. The ambulance doors slammed shut, cutting off her view. The siren wailed to life, and Sarah felt the vehicle lurch into motion. Sarah, stay with me, the paramedic in the back with her urged. Can you tell me what day it is? Sarah tried to focus, to remember, but her thoughts were slipping away like water through her fingers. The bear's roar still echoed in her ears, drowning out everything else. As the ambulance sped towards the hospital, Sarah finally surrendered to the darkness that had been creeping in at the edges of her vision. Her last conscious thought was of the bear's eyes, wild and unknowable, staring into her own. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the ambulance as it raced through the mountains, carrying Sarah away from the forest that had nearly claimed her life. But even as the distance grew, the memory of the attack clung to her like a shadow, a trauma that would shape the days and weeks to come. In the driver's seat, the EMT radioed ahead to the hospital. Incoming bear attack victim, female, early 30s. Multiple lacerations, possible fractures, signs of shock. ETA 10 minutes. As they wound their way down the mountain roads, the forest gradually gave way to civilization. But for Sarah, unconscious in the back of the ambulance, the ordeal was far from over. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological scars of her encounter would linger, a constant reminder of the day the trail she loved so much nearly became her final resting place. Harsh fluorescent lights assaulted Sarah's eyes as she slowly regained consciousness. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled her nostrils, a stark contrast to the earthy scent of the forest she last remembered. As her vision cleared, she found herself staring at a white ceiling, the steady beep of medical equipment filling the room. Sarah, can you hear me? A gentle voice called from her side. Sarah turned her head slightly, wincing at the movement. A nurse in blue scrubs stood beside her bed, a concerned smile on her face. Where am I? Sarah croaked, her throat dry and voice hoarse. You're in the hospital, honey. Asheville Regional. Do you remember what happened? For a moment, Sarah's mind was blank. Then, like a flood, the memories rushed back. The run, the bear, the attack. Her heart rate spiked, the monitor beside her bed beeping faster. The bear, she whispered, her eyes widening in fear. There was a bear. The nurse nodded, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. That's right. You were attacked on the trail, but you're safe now. You've been here for 2 days. 2 days. Sarah tried to process this information. She attempted to sit up but gasped as pain shot through her body, particularly intense in her right leg. Easy now, the nurse cautioned, gently easing her back down. The doctor will be here soon to explain everything. Just try to rest for now. Sarah nodded weakly, her mind reeling. As the nurse checked her vitals, Sarah's gaze drifted to her right leg, elevated and heavily bandaged. She could see angry red marks peeking out from beneath the gauze, a stark reminder of the bear's powerful jaws. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A middle-aged man in a white coat entered, a clipboard in hand. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Dr. Ramirez. It's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" Sarah attempted a smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Like I got hit by a truck. Or mauled by a bear." Dr. Ramirez nodded sympathetically. "Well, your sense of humor seems intact, which is a good sign. I'm going to explain your injuries now. Are you ready for that?" Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, I need to know." The doctor pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed. "All right, the most severe injury is to your right calf, where the bear bit you. The bite caused significant tissue damage and muscle tearing. We've cleaned and closed the wounds, but you'll need extensive physical therapy to regain full use of your leg." He paused, allowing Sarah to absorb this information before continuing. "You also have a fractured ankle, likely from your fall down the slope. We've set it, but it'll need to be immobilized for several weeks. Additionally, you have multiple lacerations and bruises across your body, and you lost a significant amount of blood. We had to give you a transfusion when you arrived." Sarah listened, each word feeling like a weight on her chest. The full extent of her injuries was overwhelming. Will I be able to run again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Ramirez's expression softened. "With time and proper rehabilitation, yes. But it's going to be a long road, Ms. Bennett. You'll need to be patient with yourself." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears. The thought of not being able to run to enjoy the trails she loved was almost as painful as her physical injuries. "Now," Dr. Ramirez continued, his tone becoming more serious, "I need to discuss the risk of infection. Bear bites can introduce various bacteria into the wound. We've started you on a strong course of antibiotics, but we'll need to monitor you closely for any signs of infection over the next few days." As the doctor continued to explain her treatment plan, Sarah's mind drifted. She could still hear the bear's roar, feel its hot breath on her skin. The memory was so vivid it made her shudder. "Ms. Bennett?" Dr. Ramirez's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you all right?" Sarah blinked rapidly, realizing she had zoned out. "I'm sorry, it's just... I keep seeing it. The bear. It's like I'm still there." The doctor nodded understandingly. "That's not uncommon after a traumatic event like this. I'm going to recommend you speak with one of our counselors. They can help you process what happened and develop coping strategies for any post-traumatic stress." Just then, there was another knock at the door. A police officer and a man in a park ranger uniform entered the room. "Ms. Bennett," the ranger said, "I'm Ranger Thompson from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. If you're feeling up to it, we'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident." Sarah nodded hesitantly. As the ranger and officer pulled up chairs, Dr. Ramirez excused himself, promising to check on her later. "Can you tell us what happened in your own words?" the officer asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events of that morning. As she spoke, the memories became more vivid. She described the trail, the moment she first saw the bear and its cubs, the terrifying charge. I don't really remember much after it bit me," she admitted. "Just pain, and then someone shouting. A hiker, I think his name was Jim. He scared the bear away." Ranger Thompson nodded. "Yes, we've spoken with Mr. Erickson. His quick action likely saved your life." As Sarah finished her account, she noticed the ranger and officer exchanging a look. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The ranger cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, we've thoroughly searched the area where the attack occurred. We haven't found any physical evidence of the bear or its cubs." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. But they were there. I saw them." "We believe you," the officer said quickly. "But without physical evidence, our options are limited. We've posted warning signs in the area and increased patrols, but we can't close the trails or initiate a bear hunt based solely on the incident report." Sarah felt a surge of frustration and fear. The bear was still out there, potentially threatening other hikers. So that's it? Nothing else can be done? Ranger Thompson leaned forward. Your experience is valuable, Ms. Bennett. We'd like to use your story to educate visitors about bear safety. Would you be willing to share it with our wildlife education program once you've recovered? Sarah nodded slowly. At least some good could come from her ordeal. As the ranger and officer left, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. The room felt suddenly too quiet, too still. She closed her eyes but immediately snapped them open again as images of the attack flashed through her mind. A nurse entered, administering pain medication through her IV. As the drugs began to take effect, Sarah felt herself drifting off. But even as sleep claimed her, she couldn't escape. In her dreams, she was back on the trail, the bear's roar echoing through the forest, its eyes locked on hers in that moment before the charge. Sarah tossed and turned, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from, the hospital machines beeping steadily in the background, a rhythmic reminder that she had survived, but at what cost? A week had passed since Sarah's encounter with the bear, and though her physical wounds were beginning to heal, the emotional scars remained raw. She sat propped up in her hospital bed, her injured leg still elevated, as Ranger Thompson pulled up a chair beside her. "How are you feeling today, Miss Bennett?" he asked, his voice gentle but professional. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Better, I suppose. The pain is manageable now." Ranger Thompson nodded sympathetically. "I'm glad to hear that. I hope you're up for a few more questions. We're trying to get a complete picture of what happened that day." Sarah's hands twisted in the hospital blanket, her anxiety rising at the thought of revisiting the attack. "I'll do my best," she said quietly. The ranger pulled out a small notebook and a map of the trail. "Can you walk me through your route that morning? Where exactly did you encounter the bear?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes scanning the familiar trails marked on the map. Her finger traced the path she had taken, pausing at a bend in the trail. "It was here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came around this corner, and there they were, the bear and her cubs." As Sarah spoke, she could feel her heart rate increasing, the memory of the bear's hot breath on her skin still fresh. The beeping of the heart monitor beside her bed quickened, drawing a concerned glance from the ranger. "Take your time, Ms. Bennett," Ranger Thompson said gently. "We can take a break if you need to." Sarah shook her head, determined to push through. "No, I'm okay. I need to do this." The ranger nodded, jotting down notes. "Can you describe the bear in detail? In size, color, any distinguishing features?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to recall the details through the haze of fear that had clouded that moment. "It was big, much bigger than I expected. Black fur, of course, and its eyes." She shuddered. "They were so intense, intelligent almost." "And the cubs?" Ranger Thompson prompted. "There were two, I think. Smaller, obviously. They seemed almost playful until—" Sarah's voice trailed off, her hands shaking slightly. The ranger reached out, patting her arm reassuringly. "You're doing great, Ms. Bennett. This information is very helpful." As the questioning continued, Sarah found herself growing frustrated. The ranger's questions became more specific, probing for details she wasn't sure she could provide. "I'm sorry," she said, running a hand through her hair in exasperation. "It all happened so fast. I can't remember every little detail." Ranger Thompson nodded understandingly. "That's completely normal. Ms. Bennett, trauma can affect our memories in strange ways. We're just trying to gather as much information as possible." Sarah's brow furrowed. "But why? You said you couldn't find any physical evidence. What good is all this questioning going to do?" The ranger sighed, closing his notebook. "You're right. We haven't found physical evidence of the bear or cubs at the attack site. But your account is still valuable. It helps us understand bear behavior, improve our safety protocols, and educate the public." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. "So that's it? The bear is still out there, potentially threatening other hikers, and all we can do is educate the public?" Ranger Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Bennett. But without concrete evidence, our hands are somewhat tied. We can't initiate a bear hunt or close down large sections of the park based solely on one incident, no matter how serious. Sarah slumped back against her pillows, feeling defeated. So what happens now? We've posted warning signs in the area and increased our patrols, the ranger explained. And as I mentioned before, we'd like to use your experience to help educate other hikers about bear safety. Your story could potentially save lives. Sarah nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. I understand. If it can help prevent this from happening to someone else, I'll do whatever I can. Ranger Thompson smiled encouragingly. That's great to hear. Once you're feeling up to it, we'd like you to record a short video about your experience. It'll be used in our visitor center and online resources. As the ranger gathered his things to leave, a thought struck Sarah. Wait, she said. What about the hiker who saved me? Jim, I think his name was. Have you spoken with him? The ranger nodded. Yes, we interviewed Mr. Erickson. His account corroborates yours, though he didn't see the bear as closely as you did. He's been very helpful in the investigation. After Ranger Thompson left, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. She stared out the window at the distant mountains, visible even from her hospital room. The forest that had once been her sanctuary now seemed like a threatening presence on the horizon. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Dr. Ramirez entered, followed by a woman Sarah didn't recognize. Ms. Bennett, the doctor said, how are you feeling today? Sarah shrugged. Physically or emotionally? Because those are two very different answers right now. Dr. Ramirez nodded understandingly. I can imagine. That's actually why I'm here. This is Dr. Chen, one of our staff psychologists. I think it would be beneficial for you to talk with her about your experience. Sarah hesitated, eyeing Dr. Chen warily. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about it anymore. I feel like I've been reliving it over and over with all these questions. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her voice gentle. I understand, Sarah. What you've been through is traumatic and it's normal to feel overwhelmed. But talking about it in a safe, supportive environment can be a crucial part of the healing process. Sarah sighed, conflicted. Part of her wanted to curl up and forget the whole ordeal, but another part knew she needed help to process what had happened. Okay, she said finally. I'll give it a try. As Dr. Chen pulled up a chair, Sarah braced herself for another round of questions. But instead of asking about the attack, the psychologist simply said, Why don't you tell me about your love for trail running? When did you first start? Surprised by the question, Sarah found herself talking about her passion for the outdoors, her weekly runs in the mountains, the peace she found on the trails. As she spoke, she felt some of the tension leaving her body. It sounds like the trails were a very important part of your life, Dr. Chen observed. Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. Were? She repeated softly. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back out there. Doctor. Chen leaned forward. It's okay to feel that way right now, Sarah. Recovery is a journey and it's different for everyone. We'll work together to help you process this experience, and when you're ready, find ways to reconnect with the activities you love. As the session continued, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she wasn't alone. With support, maybe she could find her way back to the person she was before the attack. Changed, certainly, but not defeated. As night fell and the hospital settled into its quiet after-hours routine, Sarah lay awake, her mind replaying the day's conversations. The bear's roar still echoed in her dreams, but now it was joined by other voices. The ranger's determination, Dr. Chen's compassion, and her own resilience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to hope for a future where the forest might once again be a place of solace rather than fear. 6 weeks after the bear attack, Sarah Bennett gripped the parallel bars in the hospital's physical therapy room, her knuckles white with effort. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she took another tentative step forward, her injured leg trembling under her weight. That's it, Sarah, you're doing great, her physical therapist, Mark, encouraged from beside her. Just a few more steps. Sarah gritted her teeth, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Each step sent shooting pain through her leg, the bear's roar echoing in her mind with every twinge. As she reached the end of the bars, she let out a shaky breath, her arms quivering from the exertion. "Excellent work," Mark said, helping her into a nearby wheelchair. "You're making real progress." Sarah managed a weak smile, but inside she felt frustrated. "It doesn't feel like progress," she admitted. "I used to run miles every day and now I can barely walk the length of this room." Mark knelt beside her, his expression understanding but firm. "Recovery isn't linear, Sarah. You've been through a traumatic experience, both physically and mentally. Give yourself time." As they finished the session, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had plagued her since the attack. The bear's eyes, wild and fierce, haunted her dreams, jolting her awake night after night. Later that evening, as Sarah lay in her hospital bed, a knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Dr. Chen, her psychologist, entered with a warm smile. "How are you feeling today, Sarah?" she asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Physically or emotionally? Because neither answer is great right now." Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. "Why don't we start with the physical? How was physical therapy today?" "Hard," Sarah admitted. "I know I'm supposed to be patient, but it's frustrating. Every time I push myself, I can hear the bear's roar in my head. It's like I'm right back there on that trail." "That's a normal response to trauma," Dr. Chen assured her. "Your mind and body are still processing what happened. Have you been practicing the grounding techniques we discussed?" Sarah nodded. "I try, but sometimes the memories are so vivid. Last night I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I could smell the bear's breath." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, have you considered that you might be experiencing PTSD? The nightmares, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance, these are all common symptoms." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "PTSD? But that's for soldiers and people who've been through war, isn't it? PTSD can affect anyone who's experienced a traumatic event," Dr. Chen explained. "What you went through was life-threatening and terrifying. It's natural for your mind to still be grappling with it." As they continued to talk, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Putting a name to what she was experiencing was somehow both comforting and frightening. The next morning, Sarah was wheeled into her 5th grade classroom at Asheville Elementary. It was her first visit back since the attack, and her stomach churned with anxiety. As she entered, her students' faces lit up. "Ms. Bennett," they chorused, some rushing forward before stopping short, unsure if they could hug her. Sarah forced a smile, trying to project a calmness she didn't feel. "Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you all." Her replacement, Mr. Johnson, stepped forward. "Class, remember what we talked about? Ms. Bennett is still recovering, so we need to be gentle and respectful." The children nodded solemnly, but Sarah could see the curiosity burning in their eyes. As she began to talk about her recovery, one hand shot up. "Yes, Tommy?" Sarah said, recognizing her most inquisitive student. "Ms. Bennett, did the bear really try to eat you?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, the bear's roar suddenly loud in her ears. She gripped the arms of her wheelchair, trying to steady herself. "Tommy, that's not an appropriate question," Mr. Johnson intervened, noticing Sarah's discomfort. "No, it's okay," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. She looked at her students' eager faces and realized this was an opportunity, not just to educate them, but perhaps to help herself process what had happened. "The bear wasn't trying to eat me, Tommy," she explained carefully. "It was protecting its cubs. In nature, animals don't attack humans for food very often. They're usually just scared or defending their territory." As she continued to answer their questions, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. The children's innocent curiosity helped her view the incident through a different lens, as a teachable moment rather than just a traumatic memory. That afternoon, Sarah sat in front of a camera at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Visitor Center. Ranger Thompson stood nearby, offering encouragement as she prepared to record her story for the park's bear safety program. "Just speak from the heart, Ms. Bennett," he advised. "Your experience could help prevent similar incidents in the future." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath as the red light on the camera blinked on. "Hi, I'm Sarah Bennett," she began, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger. 6 weeks ago, I was attacked by a black bear while running on this very trail. As she recounted her experience, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, certainly, as she relived the terror of that day. But there was also a growing sense of empowerment. By sharing her story, she was taking control of the narrative, transforming from victim to educator. That night, back in her hospital room, Sarah stood before the mirror, really looking at herself for the first time since the attack. The woman who stared back was changed. There were new lines around her eyes, a wariness in her expression that hadn't been there before. But as she traced the healing scars on her leg, Sarah realized they were a testament to her survival, not just her trauma. The bear's roar still echoed in her mind, but it was softer now, competing with other sounds: the encouragement of her physical therapist, the eager questions of her students, her own voice strong and clear as she shared her story. As she climbed into bed, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Recovery was a long road, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time since the attack, she could envision a future where the memory of that day didn't define her. She closed her eyes, ready to face whatever dreams might come. The bear might still appear, but now Sarah knew she had the strength to face it, in her dreams and in her healing journey ahead. 6 months after the bear attack, Sarah Bennett sat in her car at the trailhead parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The Great Smoky Mountains loomed before her, a mix of beauty and menace that made her heart race. She had driven here countless times before, always with excitement. Now fear coursed through her veins. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. Sarah glanced at the passenger seat where her new hiking companion, Max, a sturdy German shepherd, sat alertly. After weeks of discussion with her therapist, Sarah had decided that having a dog might help her feel more secure on the trails. Max was both a comfort and a precaution. With shaking hands, Sarah opened the car door. The crisp mountain air filled her lungs, bringing back a flood of memories, both good and terrifying. Max hopped out beside her, his tail wagging as he sensed an adventure ahead. "Okay, boy," Sarah said, attaching his leash. "Let's do this." As they approached the trailhead, Sarah paused to read the warning sign that had been posted after her attack. Her own story was there, a brief account of what had happened and advice on bear safety. Seeing it in print made it all feel real again. The first few steps on the trail were the hardest. Each rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through Sarah. Max, sensing her unease, stayed close to her side, occasionally looking up as if to reassure her. As they walked, Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the undergrowth. The forest, once a place of solace, now seemed full of potential threats. She gripped Max's leash tighter, grateful for his steady presence. About a quarter-mile in, Sarah froze. A sound in the distance. Was it a growl? Her breath caught in her throat, memories of the attack flooding back. Max's ears perked up, but he remained calm. "It's okay," Sarah told herself, her voice shaky. "It's probably just the wind. Or a squirrel. Not every sound is a bear." She forced herself to keep moving, focusing on the rhythm of her footsteps and Max's panting beside her. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders began to ease. The familiar sense of pine and damp earth brought back pleasant memories of countless runs through these woods. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. This was the spot. The exact location where she had encountered the bear and her cubs. She could almost see the scene playing out before her eyes. Sarah's legs trembled, threatening to give out. She leaned against a nearby tree, breathing heavily. Max whined softly, pressing against her leg in a comforting gesture. "It's not here," Sarah said aloud, as much to convince herself as to comfort Max. "The bear is gone. We're safe." She closed her eyes, employing the grounding techniques Dr. Chen had taught her. She focused on the rough bark beneath her palms, the solid earth under her feet, the gentle breeze on her face. Slowly, the panic began to subside. Opening her eyes, Sarah took in the scene before her. The trail looked different in the bright daylight, less threatening. The dense undergrowth where the bear had appeared was just forest now, teeming with life but not inherently dangerous. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed off from the tree and continued down the trail. Each step felt like a small victory. The further they went, the more Sarah began to relax. The familiar rhythm of hiking, the beauty of the forest, started to work their magic. As they reached a small clearing, Sarah decided it was time for a break. She found a fallen log to sit on, patting the spot beside her for Max. As she sipped water from her bottle, Sarah realized something. She was enjoying herself. "We're doing it, Max," she said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We're really doing it." The return journey felt easier. Sarah's steps were more confident, her breathing more relaxed. She even found herself smiling at the antics of a squirrel darting across the path. As they neared the trailhead, Sarah heard voices ahead. A young couple appeared around the bend, looking at a map. "Excuse me," the woman called out. "Is this the way to Laurel Falls?" For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Should she warn them about the bear? Tell them her story? But looking at their excited faces, she decided against it. Her experience, while traumatic, was rare. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied with a smile. "It's a beautiful hike. Just remember to stay on the trail and be aware of your surroundings." "Thanks," the man said. "Cute dog, by the way." As the couple passed, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had done it. She had returned to the trail, faced her fears, and even managed to enjoy parts of the hike. Tears of relief and pride welled up in her eyes. Back at the parking lot, Sarah knelt down to Max's level, hugging the dog tightly. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur. "I couldn't have done this without you." As she stood to leave, Sarah took one last look at the mountains. The forest still held dangers, she knew that. But it also held beauty, adventure, and a part of herself she wasn't ready to give up. Driving home, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. The bear attack would always be a part of her story, but it didn't have to be the end of it. She had taken the first step towards reclaiming her love for the trails. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Dr. Chen, it's Sarah. I did it. I went back to the trail today." "That's wonderful, Sarah." Dr. Chen's voice was warm with pride. "How do you feel?" Sarah thought for a moment. Tired, relieved, proud, and hopeful. For the first time in a long time, "I feel hopeful." "You should be proud," Dr. Chen said. This was a big step. Remember, recovery isn't about erasing what happened. It's about learning to move forward despite it. After hanging up, Sarah looked down at Max, who was dozing at her feet. She thought about the trail, the mountains, the forest. The fear was still there, a soft whisper in the back of her mind. But now there was something else too, a determination to not let that fear define her. Sarah Bennett, the trail runner, the bear attack survivor, scratched Max behind the ears and made a decision. Tomorrow they would go for another hike, shorter this time, maybe easier, but they would go. Because the forest, with all its beauty and its dangers, was still a part of her. And she was ready to reclaim it, one step at a time. A year had passed since the bear attack, and Sarah Bennett stood before her 5th grade class, her leg aching slightly as a storm brewed outside. The dull pain was a constant reminder of that fateful day in the woods, but it no longer dominated her thoughts as it once had. "All right, class," Sarah began, her voice steady and warm. "Today we're going to talk about local wildlife and conservation. Can anyone name some animals we might find in the Great Smoky Mountains?" Hands shot up eagerly. "Deer, raccoons, foxes," Sarah nodded, writing each answer on the board. Then, a small voice from the back of the room called out, "Bears?" For a moment, Sarah's hand froze mid-air, the chalk hovering over the board. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before turning back to the class with a smile. "That's right, Tommy. Bears are an important part of our local ecosystem. In fact, I have a personal story about bears that I'd like to share with you all." The class fell silent, all eyes fixed on their teacher. Sarah perched on the edge of her desk, her fingers absently tracing the scar on her leg through her pants. "A year ago, I had an encounter with a black bear while I was out running on a trail," she began. The memory of that day flashed vividly in her mind, but her voice remained calm. It was a scary experience, but it taught me a lot about respecting wildlife and the importance of being prepared when we venture into nature. As Sarah recounted her story, carefully omitting the more graphic details, she watched her students' expressions shift from excitement to concern to awe. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment before erupting into a flurry of questions. "Were you scared, Ms. Bennett? Did it hurt? Do you still go hiking?" Sarah answered each question patiently, using the opportunity to educate her students about bear safety and the importance of preserving natural habitats. As the discussion wound down, she noticed Tommy, the boy who had mentioned bears, looking thoughtful. "Ms. Bennett," he said hesitantly, "are you angry at the bear?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She considered it carefully before responding. "No, Tommy, I'm not angry. The bear was just being a bear. It was protecting its cubs and its territory. What happened was scary, but it helped me understand how important it is for us to coexist with wildlife responsibly." As the bell rang and her students filed out for lunch, Sarah sat at her desk, reflecting on how far she'd come. The nightmares that had plagued her for months after the attack had largely subsided, though occasionally the bear's roar still echoed in her dreams. Later that afternoon, Sarah made her way to the local newspaper office. She had been invited to give an interview about her experience for a feature on outdoor safety. As she entered the building, she was greeted by a young journalist named Mike. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming," Mike said, shaking her hand. "We really appreciate you sharing your story." Sarah smiled, following him to a small conference room. "I'm happy to help if it means preventing similar incidents and promoting responsible outdoor recreation." As they sat down, Mike pulled out a recorder and a notepad. "So, Ms. Bennett, it's been a year since the attack. How has this experience changed your life?" Sarah took a moment to gather her thoughts. "It's changed everything and nothing at the same time," she began. "I still love the outdoors, I still teach, I still live in Asheville. But my perspective has shifted. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I've learned to appreciate the wild beauty of nature while also respecting its power." Mike nodded, scribbling notes. "Do you still run on trails?" "Yes, but differently now," Sarah admitted. "I always run with my dog. Max and I carry bear spray. I'm more selective about when and where I run, but I refuse to let fear take away something I love." The interview continued, covering the details of the attack, her recovery process, and her efforts to educate others about bear safety. As they wrapped up, Mike asked one final question. "What would you say to someone who's afraid to venture into nature after hearing your story?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with conviction. "I'd tell them that fear is natural, but it shouldn't stop us from experiencing the beauty of the natural world. Be prepared, be aware, but don't be afraid to explore. The forests, the mountains, they're still magical places. We just need to approach them with respect and understanding." After the interview, Sarah stepped out onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun warming her face. She checked her watch. Still time for a short hike before dinner. She headed to her car, where Max was waiting patiently in the back seat. As they drove to a nearby trail, Sarah's mind wandered to the past year. The physical therapy sessions, the counseling, the gradual return to the trails. It had all been challenging, but she had persevered. Her students' curiosity and the support of her community had played a big part in her healing process. Arriving at the trailhead, Sarah let Max out of the car and clipped on his leash. She paused for a moment, looking at the forest before her. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, sunlight filtering through the leaves. It was beautiful, wild, and yes, still a little scary. But as she took her first steps on the trail, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling. Max trotted happily beside her, alert but relaxed. About a mile into their hike, Sarah and Max reached a small clearing. She unclipped his leash, allowing him to explore while she sat on a fallen log. Closing her eyes, she listened to the sounds of the forest. The same sounds that had once filled her with terror now brought a sense of comfort and belonging. Opening her eyes, Sarah scanned the tree line, a habit she had developed since the attack. But this time, instead of looking for danger, she found herself appreciating the beauty of her surroundings. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the clearing, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. As the sun began to set, Sarah called Max back to her side and began the hike back to the car. With each step, she felt the familiar ache in her leg, a permanent reminder of her encounter. But now, that ache also reminded her of her resilience, her ability to overcome fear and reclaim her love for the wilderness. Driving home, Sarah reflected on the day, teaching her students, sharing her story with the newspaper, and ending with a peaceful hike. The bear attack had changed her. There was no denying that, but it hadn't broken her. Instead, it had reshaped her relationship with nature, teaching her to balance caution with appreciation, fear with respect. As she pulled into her driveway, the last rays of sunlight painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Sarah realized something profound. The wilderness, with all its beauty and danger, was still a part of her, and she was still a part of it. The bear might always lurk in the shadows of her memory, but it no longer held power over her. Sarah Bennett, teacher, runner, survivor, had found her way back to the trails, back to herself. She patted Max's head as they walked to the front door. "We did good today, boy," she said softly. And as she stepped inside, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to embrace the wild, beautiful world around her. Scars, fears, and all,